Thank you for joining this event to celebrate the publication of Glenn Hubbard's new book, The Wall and the Bridge. Thanks to those of you who are here in person, those watching the live stream, and those of you who will watch the video of this event later at your convenience. I am Michael Strain, Director of Economic Policy Studies here at the American Enterprise Institute, and I'm excited to welcome you to this event to hear from Dr. Hubbard about his book and for an engaging conversation about promoting economic opportunity in the face of disruption and dynamism, the benefits of an open economy, and why populism, so popular on both the political right and left, does not offer the best solutions to our pressing economic challenges. Glenn is one of the nation's leading economists. He is a non-resident senior fellow here at AEI and the Russell L. Carson Professor of Economics and Finance at Columbia Business School. He was the Dean of Columbia Business School for 15 years and is a former chairman of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. Neil Irwin is also here with us this evening. Mr. Irwin is one of the best economics journalists in the business. He is currently chief economic correspondent at Axios. He's the author of 2 books and was previously senior economics correspondent at the New York Times and a founding staff member of The Upshot. Before that, he was a reporter and columnist at the Washington Post for 13 years, where he led coverage of the global financial crisis. Our run of show this evening is straightforward. It will begin with opening remarks from Glenn, followed by a conversation between Glenn and Neil, and we'll conclude with a Q&A session with questions from you, the audience, after that. We encourage you to submit questions on Twitter using the hashtag AskAEIEcon. That's hashtag AskAEIEcon. You are also welcome to email your questions to Mariana Mitchell. Her email address is mariana.mitchell@aei.org. You can find the spelling on the webpage for this event. Thank you again. Thank you to Glenn and Neil, and I'll welcome Glenn to the podium.
Thanks so much, Mike, for the kind introduction, and to Neil for joining tonight for a conversation, and for everybody in audiences live stream later or here in the room. You know, the book, The Wall and the Bridge, has been something on my mind for some time as an economist and a lover of policy discussions. And I just wanted to say a little bit about why I wrote the book, and then mainly leave the time, obviously, to have a discussion with Neil. You know, there are 3 themes or metaphors, if you will, that I draw through the book. One is Adam Smith, who, of course, is always heralded as the founder of modern economics, even though he himself would not have called himself an economist, much more of a philosopher. Steel, which has entered my life at multiple points in time. And actually a saying from my wife, who has always divided the world's population into economists and real people. And I'll talk about those perspectives as I go. One reason I wanted to write this book now is I have been seeing social support for the economic system, market capitalism, as declining. I wrote a piece recently in The Atlantic noting that when I taught political economy to MBA students at an elite university, so these are business school students, not people perhaps more skeptical of markets, they were nonetheless quite skeptical of capitalism. In terms of Smith, Steele, and economists and real people, I'll weave them into my thoughts, but Smith I think of as somebody who championed openness and competition. He, however, wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, and so I'll give a more contemporary view of what Smith might have talked about. He's also the author, of course, of the theory of moral sentiments, almost 2 decades before he wrote The Wealth of Nations. And Smith talked about a concept that in modern language we would call empathy. I'm going to talk about it later as an all-in economy. Steele, one of the metaphors I use in the book is the city of Youngstown, Ohio, where I've taken groups of MBA students over the years. In September 19th, 1977, all the integrated steel mills in Youngstown closed all at once without warning. I can't say exactly where I was September 19th, 1977, but I do know it was that term that I took my first course in economics. Now, if I look at the arc of the city of Youngstown from September 77 to the present and my own, we have had diverging fortunes. And a lot of that has to do with openness and how you manage it. And I'll come back to that. Steele also enters my own mind, having had a major policy loss at one point in my career of trying to advise President Bush against steel tariffs. It was at that point I first heard my wife's economist versus real people admonition. President Bush definitely was and is a real person, not an economist. The arguments that I made I thought were very persuasive. They didn't persuade him. It was years later I realized I learned the lesson from him, not the other way around, because there were larger factors at work. This book is about a coin with two sides. The heads of that coin are what we rightly celebrate as opportunity and growth in the economy. Smith literally didn't have a theory of growth. We can come back to this in Q&A if you like. I'll talk about how I connect those thoughts. But the heads of our economy is growth, innovation, dynamism, all good stuff. But the same coin has tails. And the tails of the coin is disruption. Now, I use that metaphor of a coin because you can't have one without the other. All meaningful theories that modern economists and economic historians have of innovation and growth are not about predictable, plodding scientific advance. They're about disruption and wholesale change. In the middle of that, contemporary economists, probably most notably my own colleague at Columbia, Ned Phelps, a Nobel Prize winner, has focused on dynamism and a concept that I come back to again and again in the book of mass flourishing. Mass flourishing is the opposite of walking away from growth and embracing statism. Indeed, Adam Smith's own diatribe against mercantilism 250 years ago really is what started off this battle in economics of celebrating competition and openness. But here's the rub. Disruption, because it necessarily moves people and places off the spots they thought they had in mind, creates a demand for adaptation. I apologize, I'm an economist, so I'll use words like demand and supply, probably more than a real person would in a talk. But if you create a demand for adaptation, supply can come in two different forms. One is walls, politics or political economy saying, we'll offer you protection. We will make the world like it was. Another approach is bridges, the Smithian idea. We will actually prepare you for a world that is and will be, or a more contemporary version of Smith will also reconnect you. If you fall out of the boat, we will get you back in. The problem, of course, is that walls are the default in the political process. They are easier to describe to people than bridges. And as Mike teed up in his opening remarks, on both the right and the left, we're offered images of walls. In fact, the right debate or right way to think about an economic policy debate at the moment is not so much between capitalism and socialism, which is what we read about in the paper. It's between walls from the left of protection away from work and walls from the right that say, we'll make it like the past. You don't need an open economy. Now, the modern Smith, like the old Smith, would focus a lot on competition and openness. But I think if Smith were with us today, he would also be focused on the ability to compete. Is everybody really at the same starting line? And again, the metaphor I use there is about bridges of opportunity and about reconnection, or in econ speak, social insurance. Here's the economic point. Growth is messy. It's inherently messy. All serious studies in economic history and the economics of growth tell us that. The flip side of that messiness, though, is don't believe people who are telling you that there's a 98 cents on the dollar shaving of openness that simply will make everybody better off. There's another approach. When I think about dynamism and the work of economic historians like McCloskey or my colleague Ned Phelps, I think to my mind's eye of an all-in economy in two ways. First, is there a way for me to be all in? Is there a way for me to participate in this economy? And am I able to participate? The second incantation of all in is the notion of all in. Is the economy set up for true mass participation and mass flourishing? What we're seeing, of course, in the walls of today, and I named some names in the book, maybe Neil will tease them out of me, but I'll just say some ideas. One debate we're having is about individualism versus corporatism. In other words, should we be protecting individual firms, industries, kinds of jobs? My answer to that would be absolutely not. Many successful firms and jobs today were not in the mind's eye 40 or 50 years ago. What on earth would that planner have done? A second issue that I talk about, Smith schooling, if you will, some contemporary trends, is about openness versus closeness. You know, there's an attack full bore sometimes on trade and globalization. That's really unfortunate because the same Econ 101 professor, and I know everybody in the audience loved economics. It was probably your most favorite course in college. And I know that professor, he or she told you that globalization, fairly practiced, would make economies better off on average. I'm equally sure that he or she did not tell you it would make everybody in those economies better off, but he or she probably did once again weigh in and say, but the gainers can compensate the losers. That's what hasn't been happening. The third issue that I tackle in Smith schooling is about protection versus empowerment. Do we want businesses helping employees, communities, areas in which they operate, help them succeed, or do we really want business overly protecting people? Now, in terms of policy, I argue in the book that policy has been very slow to address big structural changes. Right now, all the headlines, particularly today is a Fed day, are about cyclical movements. So we're talking about inflation today. I'm talking principally in the book about technological change, first and foremost, and then globalization, as tectonic plate shifts that have been going on for decades. I mentioned Youngstown 1977. The trends I'm talking about even predated that. Policy reacted very slowly and inaptly to structural change. The metaphor I have in my mind's eye is the question the Queen of England, of all people, asked during the financial crisis when she went to the London School of Economics, talked to a group of economic worthies at a ribbon cutting, and said, why did nobody notice? And I think what the Queen meant was, how could there be something so big as a financial crisis? You guys didn't even see it coming. If the Queen were talking about these structural questions, she might well ask the same thing. Where was the economics profession? They were certainly very visible on the head side of the coin, less visible on the tail side of the coin. Now, it's not that policy did nothing, but the things that we can name are generally small. Trade adjustment assistance is something I tackle in the book, a worthy sounding thing whose history we can talk about if you like, but suffice it to say, very small beer for the problems we faced. One challenge that I note in the book is that we once did this right. President Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War, advocated land-grant colleges in the Morrill Act, the Homestead Act, the beginning of the Transcontinental Railroad. Go back and read Lincoln's remarks at the time. His notion of what government was to do was to be a battering ram for opportunity for average people. Emancipation was obviously the most tangible example, but Lincoln's entire economic policy was built on that. The land-grant colleges as a metaphor is something I pursue a lot in the book we could talk about. Going ahead several decades, Franklin Roosevelt, toward the end of the Second World War, launched a controversial and expensive measure called the GI Bill to reconnect millions of service people to an economy that had changed while they were gone. In today's world, those things would be different. In the book, I talk about a role for community colleges and federal support therein, place-based aid of a different form than economists generally talk about, as well as very large supports for work in the form of reform of the Earned Income Tax Credit or the use of individual training incentives through things I call personal reemployment accounts. So to wrap up an opening, why now? You know, globalization and technological change have been going on a long time. Why should policymakers, why should economists, why should all of us become more agitated now? Two big reasons. The first is the factors I've mentioned are only going to get larger. When one talks to business leaders, particularly in the technology area, the growth and possibilities in artificial intelligence and robotics, and the economy's adaptation to climate change as well, are going to disrupt millions of jobs in a system that still structurally lacks a plan. A second reason is, again, a political economy one, that social support for the economic system can't be taken as given. The third and final takes that one step further in realpolitik, that what we're observing in the economy now is a well-rehearsed and well-funded battle between alternative kinds of walls, when the issue is we need bridges. So The Wall and the Bridge, I hope you read it. If you find yourself saying, you know, there are 1,000 people on my Christmas list, I forgot, I need to buy them something, The Wall and the Bridge. So Neil, I look forward to talking.
Thanks, Glenn. So exciting to be here. Thank you for coming to Washington. Again, we'll have questions in a little bit. You can email them to Mariana Mitchell, and your address is on the site announcing the event. You were chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Bush. You know, I think about the kind of economic policy community in Washington, and it can be kind of close-knit. And you and the various CEA chairs under Democrats, Republicans, you all kind of know each other. Some of them are down the street at Brookings, and some are, you know, have fellowships here. Is there something that this kind of mainstream community of the center-left and center-right have gotten fundamentally wrong the last 20 years, 30 years?
You know, in a way, I don't think so. I don't think economics is wrong. I think Smith's original ideas, and certainly if you pick up any Econ 101 textbook, you'll see exactly the right discussion of these ideas. I think the issue is more about economists than it is, dare I say it, than about economics. That we're economists noticing the flip side of these things. You know, I think there can be a world where economists are talking more among themselves or to business leaders or to other policy types, rather than actually the experience of people who are being disrupted by change. And I think that's a problem. You know, one answer to the Queen of England's question might be people weren't talking to people in the real world. I certainly think that was a problem in the financial crisis.
And you make the point, a lot of our conversations around economic policy are who's up and who's down and what's the Fed going to do next meeting, not these kind of glacial shifts in how people are living in big parts of the country.
It's true, and I think it's odd to me because we know structural issues and long-term growth really are the largest and most important questions in economics, and one would also think that politicians themselves would be concerned about these issues. There would be gold in the hills, I would think, for a politician who could promise better preparation and reconnection for millions of Americans, but it's not a conversation we're having, and that's not a partisan comment. We're not having it on either side of the aisle.
So what happens when you take Columbia Business School students to Youngstown? What do they see that maybe they're not understanding when they're in their finance courses and preparing for careers in private equity or wherever they're headed?
Well, I think there's a lot of learning in both directions. I think what my students saw, and certainly I saw, is there is no silver bullet story in any place in the country. You also understand the concerns and aspirations and dreams of business people, of employees, of social service agencies, wherever you go. And you get a sense of what it's like for individuals to be bearing risks far beyond their ability to control. You know, we often tell people, yes, you should be able to bear this risk or that risk, but we're talking about bearing risks of a technology that makes my career obsolete, or an opening of the world economy that benefits everyone on average, but might absolutely destroy my firm, industry, or town. Our social insurance systems aren't set up for that, and I think people understand that.
I mean, is there an aspect, some of these jobs, these more industrial jobs became an identity and weren't just about replacing lost income, replacing lost benefits, but when those plants go away, it seems to create a kind of crisis of community in some of these places.
Well, it does. And then the question becomes, how do you recreate that? So in the book, I give examples of some places that actually did it pretty well. So if you think about Pittsburgh after the Second World War, business leaders, very strong educational institutions, and some local political leaders said, we can see steel declining. We want a different Pittsburgh, and they got it. I also talk about the state of Massachusetts that once had textile mills as a major industry. When the textile mills started failing in the early to mid part of the 20th century, they didn't ask to have them back. They got together and figured out something new. And so the question is, how do you do that? You know, one of the complications your question suggests is America, in the mind's eye, I think, of many politicians, is a highly geographically mobile economy. That is not really true anymore. Geographic mobility, even in depressed places, is lower than it used to be. And so we have to think harder about how to help places and also how to match people and opportunity.
I mean, there's a bit of a tension in what you're describing. On the one hand, a deeper social welfare net, a social safety net can cushion some of these blows and give people the room to have a more expansive view of economic potential. On the other hand, it can be a trap. It can be, like, for example, you say you're against a universal basic income in the book. How do you finesse this? How can you have both a kind of thorough social safety net that protects people from some of the damaging things that a market economy can bring while enabling that market economy to thrive?
Well, it's a great question. I'll tackle it on two levels, one in terms of economics and two budget implications of all this. Sure. On the economic level, the key is to tie to work and opportunity. So in the book, I talk about a modern land-grant college system as being a federal block grant to community colleges, work that Melissa Carney and Austin Goolsbee and I had suggested now a couple of years ago. We also are very supportive as an economics profession of trying to decentralize research capabilities in the country. A number of prominent economists have suggested applied research centers around the country to diffuse knowledge, much as the land-grant colleges did. And I think massive supports of work are going to be required. The Earned Income Tax Credit, which is America's primary program for this, has evolved into as much a family support program as a work support program. And so I think it could be rethought. The flip side of that question is this going to cost money? The answer is yes. But the kind of money we're talking about across all of the programs I suggest in terms of work, place-based aid, and so on, might be on the order of $100 billion a year. Now, when I first started on this book, that seemed like real money. It no longer does. But in all seriousness, I suggest ways to pay for it. I'm not suggesting that we go out and borrow $100 billion a year, but I do think this is doable.
I'm going to ask you to build on something that you spend an entire chapter on in the book, and you were addressing up there, but maybe you can expound on it. What do people who have not really read Adam Smith, who kind of know Adam Smith as an abstract, kind of reference, not understand about what Adam Smith wrote and the lessons from 200 years ago for today?
It's interesting. I could speculate on lots of things, but two really come to mind. One is that the context of The Wealth of Nations was a diatribe against people like Thomas Munn, who was a great mercantilist and advisor. The ethos in the time was the role of the economy was to serve the sovereign. And so the mercantile system was designed to pile up gold and silver. That was what the wealth of a nation was, so the sovereign could buy luxuries and armies. Along comes Smith and says, no, the wealth of a nation is its ability to consume, and that means us, average people. It doesn't mean the sovereign. That was and is a radical idea, and I think people sometimes don't understand the context that brought Smith to that. The second is many people have never read The Theory of Moral Sentiments, even economists, and it's a shame because that book not only was 17 years before The Wealth of Nations, it's foundational to who Smith is. He talks in that book about a concept he calls mutual sympathy. I think today we would call it empathy. And I think Smith really was about mass participation. He and other Enlightenment thinkers wanted to believe that everybody benefited from the economy, the concept that, again, my colleague Ned Phelps has called mass flourishing. That's the goal.
I mean, it's a broader idea that you have to think of economics in the context of a moral and philosophical system.
Yeah, and that's interesting because, there wasn't an economics, if you will, when Smith was writing. He was, in fact, a moral philosopher who wrote about something that became economics. And economics should have this moral rooting. One of my teachers, who I admire greatly, Ben Friedman, has written widely on this and the moral consequences of economic growth, and in a recent book about the role of religion in the mind's eye of early economic thinkers.
So let's go from these broad abstractions to a more specific scene in the book that you tell early on, which is you're advising President Bush in the early 2000s. They're considering steel tariffs. You go in to explain why steel tariffs are a bad idea. Knowing what you know now, what you've seen the last 20 years, what would you tell your former self? What would you tell President Bush 20 years ago?
It's a great question. I actually went in thinking I had nailed it in the following sense. I wasn't just going to go in and talk Econ 101.
You knew that was not going to fly with...
Well, I knew the president well enough that alone isn't going to take it. He knew all of it. So I went in with charts, and I said, here's a chart of a declining labor share. And he said, that's what I'm trying to stop. And I said, Mr. President, what I just showed you was agriculture 1900 to 1940. Would it be your wish for us to put everybody back on the farm? Bristled a little. Then I showed him another chart. And this was a chart that the CEA staff dutifully worked very hard on to show where job losses would be from steel tariffs. And I said, sir, you may protect some in places like Wheeling, West Virginia, but you're going to lose some in all these other places. He heard me, and after he made his decision, he told me, I agree with everything you said. But I came to a political decision that I needed something bigger. There was a debate over trade promotion authority at the time and other things. And I think he was also struggling with, and finally I got him to admit to me, that you didn't bring to me anything I could do for these people. You were simply saying to me, don't do this. And I think that's what we've missed a bit as economists. And where we have offered advice in recent years, economists or quasi-economists are really about saying, just go build walls and it'll go away.
I mean, the agriculture example is fascinating, right? In the late 19th, early 20th century, massive shift in the workforce from farms to factories and cities. And, obviously there was a lot of, it's not like that was a seamless process, and I'm sure plenty of people did not like it.
And in fact, that was one of the roles the land-grant colleges played. As I talk in the book, there was an interesting political debate in many states. When the land-grant colleges were funded, they were intentionally designed to also teach what was then called the manufacturing arts, and not just agriculture. In many agricultural states, there was a battle that, land-grant colleges are going to take all the young men and women off the farm and put them in the cities. And yet, that really helped the economic transition. Likewise, the GI Bill, retrained people for new sectors of the economy. We really haven't done very much of that.
So what would a 21st century version of those look like?
Well, I think the core of it is to ask which types of institutions are likely to do that job. I think many economists in education have focused a lot on community colleges because they are very active in skill building and certificate building, which is extremely important. They are located everywhere. They are woefully underfunded. I bristle when I see proposals for free tuition at community college. How does that solve anything? The problem with a community college is it lacks the resources relative even to four-year schools in their own state. So I suggested a block grant that would be tied to measurable outcomes to help do that. Another, as I suggested, is the location of applied research centers. I think if we're funding very basic research, that may be done principally at a handful of very elite universities, but applied research that can help with translation can be done everywhere. And we know the impact of the land-grant colleges on the translation of information helped raise agricultural productivity from works V. Grillicus did decades ago to manufacturing productivity.
So is this situation where we have coastal cities that have very high per capita incomes and lots of job opportunities, and then big rural areas and semi-rural areas that are not? How much of this is the political challenge is one where there are big chunks of the country that just feel a sense of decline and do not feel that kind of expansive sense of possibility that something new can be good and not just more on what they lost.
I don't know. You know, I'm optimistic about this, but I have to tell you, optimism is a fixed effect for me, so I'm optimistic about everything. But I do think this one's fixable. One of the student trips that I took MBA students to was Decatur, Alabama, which had different structural challenges than Youngstown, Ohio. But one of the interesting stories was Nucor had built a steel mill there, largely because of labor and regulatory differences in the South than the North, but found that they had skill mismatches with the workers they needed. They started partnering with local high schools, community colleges, businesses, and what had been a declinist attitude suddenly became optimistic. This goes back to the Pittsburgh and Massachusetts example. If people lead, generally others will follow.
So President Trump had a very different view of the attractiveness of walls. Tell me about, within the kind of conservative Republican coalition, how you think thought is evolving, and are you a lone voice on this set of themes at this point?
I'm definitely not a lone voice on these themes. I think many, if not most economists would agree. I think certainly most business people think this way. It's a rare business leader who says, gee, I wish we could wall out change. I mean, that is not how business people think, thankfully. My worry is, I'm not a politician, I can't weigh on that, but I can say this, that there are no easy solutions that say, I'm going to promise you that we can keep all the benefits of innovation and growth, but I'll get rid of the disruption part by closing our borders or closing off talent or closing off opportunity. It just doesn't happen that way. That is a lie, and to say it is a lie, just as it is for politicians to go to places left behind and say, you know what, I'll bring the past back. That's not constructive either. I do, however, note in the book, and I know from my own political experience, that walls are a lot easier to talk about. Right. It is easier to tell people, I can make you well again. Change is hard, and it's harder to talk about. But I think putting muscle behind that change and having serious people behind it is still important.
Seems like in terms of political and dynamics, stoking fear is an easier emotion to trigger than kind of hope and a sense of opportunity.
Well, but then again, you look at people who did lead. Both Lincoln and FDR chose a different approach to transition. I'm not a politician, but I have to believe there's political gold in hills for a politician who actually imagined that he or she could say that and move the needle.
You kind of alluded to this from the podium. You mentioned a couple of times in the book Orrin Cass, who worked with the Romney campaign, as you did. Similar intellectual tradition in some ways, but you think he's barking up the wrong tree in how he thinks about.
Well, I do with respect. I certainly like Orrin Cass, but here's my problem with it. So basically, his argument is that Adam Smith got it wrong. So by insinuation, every economist since got it wrong, meaning rather than maximizing the consumption potential of the economy as representing the wealth of nation, it's really about production and jobs, and in Cass's mind, even particular jobs like manufacturing. The problem with that argument is, first, its conceit would be that every economist is wrong. I suppose that's possible. It's also possible this argument's wrong, and I think it's the latter. And the reason is pretty simple. Most of the really interesting opportunities we think about in our economy today were not visible decades ago. Who would know if some planning unit in a bureau in Washington said, these are the interesting jobs? I won't try to mangle my high school Latin, but an English translation of my thought is, who watches the watchers? Who gets to decide what a good job is or a good wage is? So I just think that argument goes nowhere very fast. And the way to approach some of the same legitimate concerns I think the argument is aimed at is to take those people and places and help them. I think we need to be about people and places, not firms and industries.
So you say, economic distribution matters, right? We do worry about whether working class people are having enough income to have a good life. is there a tension between that view and, you've always been an advocate of low taxes on capital income and the kind of economic strategy that focuses on deregulation on low taxes. Is there a tension between that and making sure that working class incomes are rising?
I don't think so in the following sense. I think we still want, as going back to Smith's own intuition, as large of a pie as we can have. I do note in the book that we should be willing to do things like moderate increases in the corporate tax to pay for some of the programs that I have talked about in the book. But I don't think we need a wholesale tax reform. I don't think that's really what's driving this, nor do I think, and it was interesting, in talking to people in distressed places, nobody was complaining about billionaires. What they were complaining about is nobody noticed them. Nobody noticed they had problems, struggles, dreams, aspirations. And when a politician says he or she does notice, they perk up. And I think that's what we need to do, is notice and help. So I don't think it's as much about taxes.
You criticized at one point the Business Roundtable statement on stakeholder capitalism. What's wrong with companies thinking of things beyond shareholder returns as they set their strategies?
There's absolutely nothing wrong with thinking. Indeed, I argue in the book that I think business people, prominent business people particularly, don't play as large a role on the stage as they could. They have very large social respect that they command, and they should use it. My point was, if you focus on stakeholders to the meaning that as a business leader, can just say, I'm maximizing this today and that tomorrow, when are you ever going to be able to hold a person accountable? I use as a foil in the book Milton Friedman's essay, now almost 52 years old, where he argued that the social responsibility of business was to maximize its profits, full stop. I'd written an essay on the 50th anniversary of Milton's piece saying, look, if you simply put long-term in there, that's still more or less right. A company that's focused on its long-term value necessarily treats its workers well, its customers well, its suppliers well. Otherwise, it's not going to be a prospering business. So I think that it's stakeholder without a definition or a metric strikes me as squishy and, dare I say it, corporatist. I think we want an efficient business sector.
Right, in the long-term point, if you're a company, a recession rolls around, if you know you want your employees to be there on the other side of that recession, maybe you keep more people on the payroll.
Sure, but that's a long-term value statement. And I may also think that this particular R&D project, although it's going to hit cash flow a lot today, means a lot to the future of this industry. And if I, as the CEO, can persuade the board to go along with me, then I do it.
How much do you think, you were Dean of Columbia Business School for a long time, stepped down now teaching, the business leaders of tomorrow, how much of this kind of thinking is in their mindset, do you think?
A lot. I'm super optimistic about business school students. There's skepticism about capitalism sometimes, scares me a little, but I'm super optimistic because more than students I would have had 15, 20 or plus years ago, they understand the importance of context. I always remind them that the word, a term of a corporation, that's not just an economic concept. It's a legal concept, and more importantly, it's a social concept. And they get that. So I think they're more concerned about politics, the role of business in society, than students might have been 20, 30 years ago. So I think that's all very, very positive. And I think it's incumbent upon those of us who believe in openness and dynamism to take that gospel to them.
So we'll go to your questions in just a moment, but let's talk about the current political context a little bit. To what degree do you think the bipartisan infrastructure bill that has already passed and Building Back Better that is in flux as we speak, how responsive or non-responsive are these Biden policies to the kind of agenda that you're describing?
I think it's a mixed bag, but largely non-responsive. I mean, if I think about the infrastructure bill, the part of it that's actual infrastructure, I think, by which I mean airports, roads, bridges, things like that, and even technology infrastructure like broadband, I think one could make an argument for that as being related. Build Back Better troubles me in a couple of ways. Even the pieces that seem to overlap, like community colleges, as I suggested, the whole emphasis was on making community college education free without a beat of Lincoln's intuition of no, it's about supply, not
That the issue is
demand.
not that community college is too expensive. The issue is that
We
there
don't have
aren't
the
enough of them and good enough and with enough.
With good enough outcome. The problem in community colleges, as Melissa and Austin and I noted, is the number of people who simply aren't graduating. And what can we do to make that happen? Making tuition free is not really going to change that. And then many of the other items in Build Back Better are not really aimed at work. I get kidded sometimes by my friends on the left that it's because I'm a Presbyterian or a Calvinist that I'm very attracted to work, and I suppose that's true. But it's also, I think, what Smith meant. If you really want to be a participant in the economy, you want to be a part of it. And when I hear people say we can just put somebody on the dole, I don't think of that as a budget item. I think of it as you're telling that person they aren't economically useful. That's a loss of human dignity that we shouldn't tolerate. So I'm not a fellow traveler on Build Back Better.
It is intriguing that, for example, the child tax credit has gone away for now, but the polling does not suggest people are all that unhappy about that on average. And there were the stimulus payments early last year that seem to have created no lasting political benefit to the president. Something about people just getting a check does not.
Well, I think people are really, everybody, of course, will take a check if you give it to them. I certainly would too. The question is, though, what yields satisfaction? Phelps' Nobel lecture, when he used the World Values Survey to talk about what leads to satisfaction, it really is meaningful connection to satisfying work. And the more we could do to support people in work, as opposed to simply giving people a check, the better. We shouldn't have a country where people who work full-time are poor. Right. That should not happen. And we can fix that.
And it gets back to what we alluded to earlier, the kind of sense of identity, the sense of kind of psychological sense of purpose. A weekend is a lot more fun when you've put in an honest week's work and feel like you're relaxing at the end of the week. Last one before we go to your questions. I'm just going to throw Queen Elizabeth's question to you. So why didn't anybody see it coming?
I think it's interesting is on the one hand, we did, every economist who knows Econ 101, and since I have written a popular Econ 101 book, I certainly know if you can go to my book and find gainers can compensate the losers, blah, 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 blah. But I don't think we had been seriously focused as a profession. Many individual economists, very talented ones have, but I think as a profession, especially those of us who were closest to the policy process, I think we were talking more often to the winners than to the losers.
Here's one. Won't building walls that reduce immigration help the working classes' wages and jobs?
Well, immigration is a very difficult question because there's really two questions. There's a low-skilled labor market and a very high-skilled labor market. Let me take the latter first. I don't think there would be much of a well-reasoned argument to suggest that we don't want engineers and scientists in our country. I always say that, like at Columbia Business School, half of our students are not Americans. It would be my aspiration that they all live here. Not because I'm a saint. I want the smartest people in the world working in our economy. So I think that one we can take off the table. For low-skilled work, it is more arguable. There are studies on either side of effects on domestic wages. But I think the better policy, either way you come out on that, is to support work. So I think the basic premise should still be for openness.
Does the social safety net inhibit the adjustment to changed economic fundamentals and hurt its recipients over the long run?
I think it depends what you mean by a social safety net. A social safety net that's principally tied to work, I don't think does. A more meaningful EITC and earned income tax credit, so just to be more fleshed out on that, it's not as generous for single workers as it should be. And the way it's structured in terms of its phasing out for a variety of reasons doesn't make it as effective as it could be. So supporting work, I think, would be something that draws people in, not pushes them away. At the same time, I could imagine social safety nets that do the opposite. If universal basic income would be such an example, which I don't think ties people to work and flourishing.
So that, and that was on my list too. So what you dislike about a UBI is that it's is this dimension of work that you feel like work is too important.
It's funny because when I've talk to other economists or intellectuals about UBI, Universal Basic Income, I often get the thing of, why am I against somebody who wants to be an artist in Greenwich Village? And most of the people we're talking about, I don't think being an artist in Greenwich Village is necessarily the aspiration every American has. I think each person has a meaningful
I
aspiration.
also don't think you can afford that on the
yeah, exactly.
numbers that would be involved.
Exactly. So I think the question is, how do we help people achieve the flourishing that they want? And I think if you look at the work that Ann Case and Angus Deaton did on opioids and alcoholism, I think the problem in many areas is closely tied to disassociation from work. Here at AEI, Nick Eberstadt's work on men without work is very telling.
The First Step Act enacted, could prison reform be an agent of change for retraining and dismantling walls in many parts of the country?
Definitely can. One of the things I'm very proud of in my tenure at Columbia, we have a reentry program that's run through our Tamer Center for Social Entrepreneurship, where we have MBA students and faculty who work in prisons on exactly that kind of retraining. It's a super important opportunity for our economy.
Here's a fun one. Have corporations become too woke?
I don't know. I don't think so. I think most corporations are very serious stewards of their shareholders' long-term value. And I think they're also, cognizant of social pressures. There's certainly times in which corporate leaders are pressured. I teach a class in our MBA program, I'm just starting, on business and society, where, a key topic is, how does a business leader react to social movements, social justice questions? But I don't think they're, quote, too woke.
Are you worried that the child tax credit keeps people on the sidelines?
I think these are empirical questions. I think the design of these tax credits is important to make sure that they don't disincentivize work. So I can imagine designs that are work enhancing and some that are much less so or go the other way.
Gotcha. How much does it matter for this entire kind of philosophical framework you're laying out, achieving kind of a macro, hot labor market, good macro outcomes? One argument is that we actually were under potential in terms of the labor market for a lot of the last 20 years, that's one factor in this kind of sense of, if you lose your job at the factory, there's not another one waiting for you. Is there something at the macro level that helps ease these transitions you're describing?
Well, certainly an economy whose aggregate demand management is good and is close to operating at potential, that's got to be a good thing. It, however, is not going to solve these structural problems. And I worry when policymakers confuse the two. I worry when the Federal Reserve imagines that a hot economy is going to solve the labor force participation rate problem, a social problem to be sure, but not a monetary policy problem. So I think these are related but distinct questions, and the question for structural policy is to focus on that. The problem is, we've been talking about, for politicians or even policymakers, focusing on something that's slow moving tends to be hard. The reason the Queen could ask her question again and again and again is because it's easy to miss a slow moving, if big thing.
I mean, yes, the Fed can't micromanage, different pockets of the labor force or different localities, but there's an argument that, when they, their policies in the 2017, 18, 19 period before the pandemic really were creating higher labor force participation, that we did have a hotter labor market than we'd had for most of this century.
Well, economic growth was faster, tax policy.
A lot of good things were happening.
A lot of things were happening. But I do think that if we are focused on participation, and I think we should be, we need to think more structurally and not just knock on the doors of 20th and Constitution.
That's well. So So why has labor force participation stagnated over the last year, do you think?
That's a very good question. It has many sources. We know that demographic factors are key in labor force participation, but they can't explain sudden changes. I mean, each of us gets older 1 year every year. It's like clockwork. So it can't explain a sudden decline. There are a lot of pandemic factors related to health conditions, the ability to work, supply chain issues. Those, I think, will be fixed. A larger question is about the so-called Great Resignation. I am not a specialist in this area, but I am skeptical that we have entered a new era in which people have just decided to opt out of work unless they have simultaneously opted to win the lottery. So I think they'll come back.
I mean, the great resignation does coincide with the great hiring, right? A lot of that is churn, which I think in a dynamic economy is probably a good sign, right?
Well, churn is good.
Yeah.
As I point out in the book, people are so focused every month on labor flows that are net flows. The flows that are interesting are the gross flows. That's the sign of dynamism in the economy. We look at numbers and we say jobs gained or lost. We're talking about numbers that look small against two very large shifts, gains and losses. That's the more interesting thing. And I think a lot of the wall builders have in mind, let's push those gross numbers down. That's not a healthy economy.
I'm struck by how a lot of the discourse around work and labor, especially in the 2010s, doesn't look great with hindsight, right? There was a lot of automation, taking people's jobs. What's going to happen when AI and robots take all the jobs? What's going to happen with, it was almost like trying to want lower productivity, not focusing on and worrying about creating more jobs.
I certainly worry about things like robot taxes and things like this. Having said that, we also need a plan that helps people get ready for that world. Keynes wrote about this, of course, in his message to his grandchildren in 1930, that people would, work would disappear. How are people going to occupy their time? So it's been on people's mind for a long time.
Netflix, it turns out, is the answer.
Netflix, it turns out, is the answer, or video games, or whatever. But I do think that we are unprepared as a society, and it's not just the globalization and technological change we've been through. As I said, it's going to come at us even faster and in different pockets. When we think about technological change and globalization, your first blush is to think about manufacturing. But when I think about artificial intelligence and some of these things, I could think of lots of mid-skill service sector jobs, which are far more numerous in the economy, that are affected. So we've got to get ready.
When you think about things like healthcare, where kind of augmented reality stuff and things that can help mid-skill professionals provide care, you can imagine a lot of ways that
Exactly.
all kinds of jobs can become higher productivity, higher value through these technologies. It's not costing jobs; it's changing jobs.
No, exactly. And of course, there's a debate in the economics profession right now as to whether robotics is going to increase or decrease jobs on net. But whatever the answer is on net, we know there are going to be large disruptions in particular areas, and that's the task of policy to prepare people.
How much does the speed of these changes matter, right? I feel like part of what we saw in the 90s and 2000s was a lot of industrial base went away at one time.
Yeah, I think it matters a lot. In the book, I talk about 3 factors of structural changes in recent decades that were probably riveting. One is how long lasting they were. Originally politicians thought we'd just bring things back. That didn't happen. The second is that they were fast, much faster than we thought. And the third is how geographically concentrated some of these hits were. So in the book, I talk about obviously the well-known work that David Autor and co-authors have done on the China shock, but there are other shocks that have had similar such effects in the technology area, and I think people just weren't ready for that.
Well, how do you assess the China shock literature with a little bit of distance? How much is that a worthwhile narrative for understanding what happened to industrial America in the last 25 years?
Well, I don't think it's an overwhelming narrative by any means. As I mentioned at the podium when I was talking about Youngstown, the bigger factor affecting most heartland economies really is technological change more than it is globalization. If we built a wall around this country, if anything, we would only increase business people's desire to substitute technology and capital for labor. So I think we have to be careful about it. But the one thing I will say about China is, China has not played by the rules that many of us encourage leaders of the country to allow them to be part of the WTO. China has not honored those commitments.
How much do you think just the pandemic and everything we've been through the last couple of years the trade wars under Trump, the geopolitical tension with China. Are bridges really really the pathway to what the next phase of the economy looks like in that kind of environment?
I think it has to be. I mean, I think there's only two, as I was saying in my remarks, the demand for disruption only has two outlets. There's a supply of walls and a supply of bridges. The supply of walls really does throw the baby out with the bathwater. There goes the innovation, the dynamism, what Deirdre McCloskey would call innovism. Bridges have to be the answer. The problem is articulating what an all-in economy looks like, that it's both an individual being all in and having everybody all in. That's harder. It's not a bumper sticker the way America First is or Build the Wall.
I mean, it strikes me a corollary of what you're describing is that the bridges approach is a grow the pie, focus on an expansive vision of what's possible. The walls are.
But it's not just grow the pie. That's the difference. I mean, you could say that a neoliberal orientation, which I take to mean let her rip on the economy with very few guardrails, that's focused entirely on growing the pie. By all in, I mean, everybody's in this boat before I speed it up. And so I think that is a different approach. That is a bridge. You could be a neoliberal without advocating some of the bridges that I've done. What I've tried to do is put the liberal back in neoliberal. Liberal meaning Adam Smith, not the U.S. meaning of the word.
Any comments or questions from the handful of people we have in the room? Not, I have one more. So this is, I'll read the exact question and expand on it a little bit. So what are the prospects of the political system building bridges rather than walls? Meaning, you've been around Washington, around high-level business circles for a long time. Is there a pathway for this kind of philosophy really becoming the driving source of policy in a world where the most recent nominees of both parties sounds like do not embrace the approach you're describing?
Well, the easiest answer would be to say this is completely naive and will never happen. And your example makes it true. If I were to look at men and women who are plausible presidential candidates in both parties, I would certainly find among them wall builders. Having said that, we have had turning points in our politics where a leader steps in and says, this failed. I want to try something else. I want to show you something that works and has examples and does it. Is he or she out there? I'm sure they are. I'm not politically smart enough to know who he or she is, but they're there.
I feel like if the last couple of decades have taught us nothing, it's that politics can change quickly and in unpredictable ways when circumstances change. And
For sure.
I think that's one clear lesson. Glenn Hubbard, thank you so much for talking to us. The book is The Wall and the Bridge, available everywhere now?
Everywhere.
Thanks so much, Glenn.
Thanks, Neil.